Well, folks, I'm here with Lyle Farrand, and he is the nephew of Wes Farrand, who's going to be inducted into the C.A.R.B Hall of Fame here soon. Lyle, first of all, I appreciate you taking your time here to sit down with us and talk a little bit about your uncle, and also let me congratulate you and your family on Wes being inducted into the C.A.R.B Hall of Fame.
Thank you, Mike. It's nice of you, and it's nice of you to take time to film this. I appreciate it. My family is very proud of this. Wes would be very proud of it. And I know it would mean a lot to him.
Yeah, okay. Wes got his start in about 53 or 54, and he was racing up around St. Joe and Atchison, some small tracks up that way.
He was driving for a fellow named Leonard Whitty. Wes, when he first got out of high school, he went to school over in Raytown, Missouri, and he ran a couple old coupes for a couple local guys there in Raytown, and then he went up there and started driving for Leonard up there in about 54, late 54, around Atchison, Savannah, St. Joe. They won a few races up there when he first started, and they were driving coupes then. That's pretty much what everybody was driving that period of time.
I'm thinking of one other track that you told me that just kind of popped into my head, Beverly.
Yeah.
Which was in
St. Joe.
Was in St. Joe.
Yeah. They raced up there, and of course, you know, it was close to Atchison, and Leonard lived up in there, and they raced up in that area there in Savannah.
Yeah. At
that time.
You know, that was such a great time in the history of racing, I think, because it's changed. The face of racing has changed so much, you know, over time. But I mean, these were guys that just kind of went out and dug some stuff up and made race cars out of them and went out there and did it.
Those cars were pretty much in those days made from the ground up. They had bodies on them kind of similar to some of the cars in that period of time or before, but the frame and everything on them, they needed parts. They usually just made them themselves or got old car parts and made them and made them into race cars.
By 1955, Wes has kind of stepped things up a little bit, and he started racing at Olympic, Riverside, and Lakeside, running what they then called a modified coupe. Can you tell me a little bit about what kind of cars those were?
Well, the ones Wes started driving right at that time period for Elmer Lane of Kansas City, and they were driving coupes, like you said. He had a number 81 coupe he drove for Elmer at that time, and he drove for 2 or 3 years with him, and also a number 91. And the cars had nicknames. A lot of the cars did back there. And Wes was driving for Elmer, and Elmer was the wrench on it, and he owned the cars. And they raced at Olympic Stadium and Lakeside, like you said, and around here in Riverside at that time period. This is like 55 to 56 or 7 in there.
By 58, 59, he's still, I think, driving for Elmer Lane and also Ike Peters. They own a car together. And once again, they're running at tracks up north.
Well, they were running up north, and they were running around Kansas City, too. It was number 11 car, the one Ike Peters and Elmer had together, and Wes raced it for a little over a year, like you said, there, 58, 59, that time period. Elmer and Ike kind of split up there at the end of 59, and they went different directions, so that was about the end of that ride at that time. It was a good car, and they won several races with it. Number 11, it was really it's kind of a cross between a coupe and a super modified, and they just were getting, you know, the cars were switching or kind of changing into a time in that time period in what we call super modifieds. Yeah.
And once again, and I don't know how many times I've said this in the last few weeks, but the V8s were really starting to come into play then, especially that small block Chevy and some Ford engines, but the face of racing was really starting to change.
It was, and like you say, they were going to big blocks, and most of them, there were different ones though there were a few around Kansas that had Ford, but most of them were Chevys, and you know, or GMC, the same thing pretty much. And Elmer and them had them Jimmys in theirs, for a long time.
Yeah, they were a big motor also. There again, talking about the straight sixes, the Jimmies, and of course the Hudson Hornet was really in play in that time too. But they were starting to run the V8s, is what Wes was doing.
That's right. That's right. That's what they ran around here, pretty much.
In 1960, Wes was driving for a guy with a lovely nickname. I love this, Blow By.
He did.
Who was that, and where were they racing?
He was out of Topeka. He had a car. It was a number 15. It was a super modified. And they run Topeka over there, and the fairgrounds track there on the main drag in town there. And Wes won a lot of races with him. And they'd run over there at Topeka, what they call Sleepy Hollow too. And in fact, they even went on up to Knoxville and ran. The guy's real name was Dwayne Vobach, but his like you said, his nickname was Blowby.
Yeah. Did he talk a lot, or what? Do you know what the?
Well, I never did get to meet him. I've just heard about him, but everybody told me he was a heck of a mechanic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he sure was. Just before he went to driving for him, though, he went back to that Leonard Whitty, and they were driving around the Kansas City area and up there at Atches again. He had, by this time, had a super modified. This was after Elmer and just before Blowby, and they won quite a few races too. I mean, at different racetracks. They'd run a lot up in Savannah in that period of time, and they won quite a bit up there. But they were around here in Kansas City too.
I think one thing that was really important in those times was, like you say, a good mechanic, a good fabricator, and somebody that could really put one of those things together and really make them run, because a lot of it was really pretty basic equipment.
It was, compared as we know today. Today everything's bolt on and the cars are so equal today. In those days it wasn't like that, and like you said, a very basic, and they had a good motor, and a good mechanic could get your car set up, and if he, with experience, an experienced mechanic would know some tricks that newer guys wouldn't, and in them days that was a big advantage, a lot more so than it is today.
Right. In '63, Wes starts driving for another Hall of Fame member, Luther Brewer, who was inducted, I believe, 2 years ago. But I seen some of the pictures of Luther's cars. Man, he had some beautiful stuff that he looked like he built. Really a craftsman at building race cars.
Luther did have good cars. Yeah, Wes drove a number 97, a C.A.E. car for Luther. Luther was a postmaster in Olathe, and he built cars. He had several cars. Ray Lee later drove for him after Wes did, but Wes drove, and they won quite a bit of races. And it was a good car. I mean, it was a good race car for that period of time. And Luther was a good mechanic and a good car builder.
It's amazing to me how, like you say, some of these guys whose occupations have nothing to do at all with mechanical ability or, being able to fabricate stuff or build anything, get into racing, and yet they themselves have these abilities to be able to do this and make winning pieces out of mechanical equipment. It never ceases to amaze me.
I'm going to say something about Wes here on that, and just exactly what you were talking about. Guys like Luther Brewer and like Elmer Lane, or even this Leonard Whitty and Blowby. These were guys I don't know if Wes was a little more fortunate than some, but these guys were good machinists, good mechanics, and I mean they were. I don't want to use the word special so much, but they were special in a way.
Yeah.
They just like you said, he was just a common everyday working guy, but he was a heck of a race car mechanic, and he loved race cars. And to talk about Luther there, and he was very good at what he did. He built good equipment, as did many of them that Wes drove for.
Yeah. And I think you and I talked about it on the phone just a little bit the other day, but in that time, guys were jumping around from car to car and owner to owner and whatever. And I guess what it was is they always felt like maybe there was a little advantage in this other car or this guy that really built fast race cars.
I agree with that, and I think it worked both ways. The drivers did a lot of that, but the owners also
car
did too.
owners
They'll fire a guy to get a better driver. But there was a lot of moving around, a lot different than it is today. I mean, it seems than today, but there was good quality of drivers out there in that period of time. And you know, there were, just like any time period, anywhere on earth, anything about life, there's some that are a little better than others, and some are a little less. And the drivers would take advantage of it. They thought they could get in a better car. But it also worked the other way too, where the owners could, you know, they do the same thing. If they thought they had a little better driver sitting over there and could get them to victory lane, they'd hire him or run the other off. They'd fire him.
Yeah.
I mean, but sometimes this is just a race to race. Sometimes it's a half a season or a season. This went on all the time.
In '63 and '64, Wes really hooks up with a pretty neat chassis ride, and he's driving for Charlie Aldridge. Can you tell me a little bit about this car that Charlie had?
Charlie was another one of those quality mechanics and builders, and kind of a special kind of a sort. Charlie built a Roadster that was like 5 or 6, 7, even, you know, years ahead of its time when it came out. He had it there in '64 or '5, right in there is when it came out, and it was just kind of ahead of its time. It was a pretty special car. Again, Wes won quite a bit with it. He won Olympic Stadium. He raced several places with it, and it was a good car for in its time. And Charlie was a good builder.
They, like you say, they were definitely ahead of their time. And if I remember correctly, eventually they were outlawed because they did have an advantage, I think, over some of the other cars that were running at the time.
Well, at the time, there wasn't as many rules as there later got to be on the engine size, aerodynamics, everything. Back in that period of time, early '60s, is you brought a good car, you pretty well run it, unless it was something. I remember one time later on when Gene Jennington had a dually tire, 2 duals on the outside.
I remember that. Yes,
and they kind of banned that later. But he was innovative. He come up with a good idea and it worked. But somebody banned it later. I mean, that's how these things got to that point. I mean, these guys were good mechanics, and they'd think things up, invent things that were just, you know, ahead of their time.
Yeah.
And they were good mechanics and good car builders.
I think back of the racing back in the '60s, of which I was fortunate to get to watch a lot of it. And one of the things that I think about is there was no tech area, so to speak, in those days. It was a run what you brung. But of course, maybe one of the big downsides to that also was the safety issue, in that a lot of these cars were not the safest vehicles to be taken on the racetrack.
Well, they probably weren't, but today, you know, it's developed over the years into where safety's a major portion, and it was key in that period too, but nothing to the degree that it is today.
Right.
There weren't as many rules. There weren't this or that, and you know, for a long time, them cars ran without, you know, cages on them, and it just kind of developed over the years, and just, of course, the cars got safer as they went along, but. You know, everybody pretty much had the same thing as far as safety in them period of time, and you know, they were safer than the cars that were in the '50s.
Yeah.
But you know, they weren't near as safe as cars are today, of course.
Not what they got today.
And they had different limitations, like you said, Mike. Today, you know, you got the weight rules, you got tire rules, you got engine rules. There wasn't any of that in effect at that period of time.
Not much tech going on.
No, there wasn't.
In '65. In this Roadster, Wes is leading the Jayhawk Nationals, which of course has been, or was, a big race that we had here in this area for a number of years. 4 sprint cars, now it's kind of changed over to modifieds.
Yeah.
But he's leading the Jayhawk Nationals at the fairgrounds at Topeka, and he's in the Roadster. They're having a bunch of yellows. And tell me what happens with Wes as far as that race goes.
That was quite a race. Wes really wanted to win it. I was a boy. I was probably 10 or 12 years old, and he picked my brother and I up, and we rode over to Topeka with him and a friend of his. And I could just tell that day he was gung-ho to win. I mean, he was quiet, but he wasn't talking about it, but just the way he was, I could see
his demeanor.
he was ready to go racing. And of course, when the race started, he was back and almost towards the back of the field, and there were, I think, 20-some cars in it, and he went right to front. He was in front 3 or 4 laps. I mean, he was hooked up. The car was running well, and it was a big race. I think it paid $1,000 in them days, which was a lot of money in 1965. And it was also, it wasn't so much the money, it was the idea that you wanted to win this because it's a once-a-year race, and it was kind of at the end of the year, and it was kind of a big deal to win. And he had never won it, and he wanted to. Well, he jumped in the lead, and he went to leading, and he was up there. Nobody had anything for him that day. He led quite a while, and there were several cautions, people spinning out or this or that happening. And this roaster didn't have quite as big a fuel tank as the others, and there were just too many yellows, and they run out of fuel with a lap and a half to go. He come around, take the white flag, and he spun on the backstretch on the white flag lap, coming around for the white flag. And I've recently spoke with Ray Lee. We were talking about this race, just visiting. And
Ray Lee Goodwin.
And him and Wes were good friends. And Ray Lee was in that race, and he says he remembers seeing Wes spin going into the infield because he was out of fuel on the backstretch, coming around with the white flag. And he said it seemed like forever for the next car to come by, which in this case was Jerry Weld.
Oh boy.
Jerry won the race, but Wes had a big lead over Jerry, and he'd lapped everybody in the field but Jerry. And he was running well, and he was going to win, but it's just one of them deals that happens in racing sometimes, and he didn't, and of course he was disappointed. Jerry told him there before we left that he would give him the trophy or whatever. He felt bad about it. Everybody felt bad, but it is what it is. Yeah. That's what happens sometimes with race cars.
The thing about the Jayhawk Nationals, too, and particularly around that era, was I think it was planned so that they could catch people either, like you say, in August, either going or coming from Knoxville, because there'd be a lot of sprint car drivers traveling. And like you say, it was a pretty big deal to win that race, and big money for that time.
Yeah, it was, and this particular year, I think it was after Knoxville there a little bit, but like you say, it was a big deal, and there's always a good, solid group of drivers that made the field to make the race, and it was quite a big deal. And it just, like I said earlier, it was a bad deal. He was disappointed.
Yeah.
We rode home from Topeka over there, and it's about 80 miles over here, and he didn't say one word, and there wasn't much to say anyway.
Yeah, what do you?
One of them deals that just happens, and you go on from it. But that was a big race he really wanted to win.
Yeah. In '66, Wes is running with a top bunch of drivers for the period. I mean, when you stop and think about some of these names in the competition level, I mean, it sounds like Wes was at the top. He's running with the Wells, like you say, Ray Lee Goodwin, Jay Woodside out of Wichita, Dick Sutcliffe. I mean, every one of those names are guys that were at the top of racing at the time.
In that time period in Kansas City area, and like you say, out to Wichita and up through Iowa and in the general vicinity here, there were a lot of good race car drivers, and there's several of them that are in the Knoxville Hall of Fame and also the National Hall of Fame up there at Knoxville that ran out of this area, and they run week in, week out with each other in this area, and there were good drivers. And Wes, he raced with a lot of them. He raced the first 7 Nationals up there, Knoxville Nationals, and he was close in the second one. Him and he was running third in it and got involved with the 2 leaders, got into it, Greg Weld and Roy Robbins out of Kentucky there.
First winner.
They won the year before in '61, and this was '62. They were racing for the lead up there, and Wes said he had a faster car. He told me this later, of course, that he thought he had the best car up there, and they were kind of banging each other off each other and going down the back stretch and the front stretch, and he knew they were going to get into it. Well, they eventually did pretty quick, and Greg and Robbins, they banged each other, and then they slammed into West, and he flipped out of the ballpark. I mean, it was a bad wreck, and he went to hospital that night. It was a rough night. But he run well that race, and he raced up in Knoxville up there until 60. I think the last year in the Nationals was 67. He started in just, I think, every A he was up there in, all from 61 through there. He did fairly well. He started 11th there, I think, in 66. The year Jay won it, and I'm not sure where he finished, but in that area somewhere.
Okay. During this time frame, he's also driving for Junior Hauer off and on when he needs a second car driver.
Junior had 2 cars there for a while, and Wes drove one of his when he didn't have any other rides, and Junior was, kind of an older guy, won a lot of things at Olympic Stadium, and he was a little older than some of them guys, the Wells, and we're at Wes and them, but he won a lot of races, and he built cars from scratch, and he had twin cars there, 23 and 24, and Wes drove the 23 at times there for Junior when he didn't have anything else going on. I mean, it wasn't a permanent deal, but occasionally.
As Wes's career starts winding down, like you say, I think 67, is that correct, was the last year that he drove?
Pretty much so. I think it is.
Okay. And was there a reason he retired?
Well, I don't know if there's a real reason. He loved racing. He probably would have raced more. I think it was just like a lot of them. Sometimes it comes down to money.
Yeah.
And in that period of time, that's where it came down to. And he also was good friends with Judd Larson. Judd was a guy from out of Texas, and he landed in Kansas City there in the early 50s. And Wes and several other drivers kind of hung out with Judd. And Judd went on. He got went on back east, rushed with the big boys, and even running the Indy 500. He run sprint cars for USAC, and in fact, Judd it took his life there in Reading, Pennsylvania in '66. But I don't know. Wes was close to him, but I don't know if that was so much. I think it was just probably time for him to do pretty well. I mean, it's just the way it worked out financially, and it was just time for him to let some of the others do it.
Yeah. Now, when he retired, did he stay in this area?
He stayed in here till he stayed here probably 10 years, and then he went to Florida for about 20 years, and then he moved back. But when he was in Florida, he helped some boys that drove down there, asphalt and dirt tracks. 2 or 3 tracks that come to mind was Auburndale. There was one at Ocala. They had one at Lakeland, Florida, had a 3¼ mile track, a paved track that they did. But Wes helped several drivers down there and got to know them, because he liked going to races, and he'd help them set them up. Dude Teat was one of them. Jim Childers was one of them.
Big names in Florida. We don't know much about them here, but big in racing.
Those 2 were especially. Eddie Kelly came out of Florida, and he later lived in Indianapolis, and Wes helped him with the sprint cars down there, and they all appreciated his help.
Yeah.
And it kept him around racing too, and it's what he liked.
Yeah. I was going to say, if the fire never goes out, it might go to some embers or something, but it never goes out. I think once you get the racing fire going, man, it burns.
I've been around racing my whole life. I never did drive. I've went to a lot, and I've recently retired, and I've been going all over the country, places I wanted to go to see different racetracks that I always read about in the speed sport news. And all my travels, and it's very true of Wes, as many guys that he raced against that I know that are still alive, that it just really never gets out of your system.
Never.
It's in your blood, and it's something you like. And I've found over the years, and I've heard several of these guys that drove for a living say this, that some of the racing people you're around, you get to know over the years, are some of the best people you ever meet in your life.
Yeah.
And it's just it's a good bunch of people as a whole, and just like in all walks of life, there's a few that's,
bad apples.
Yeah, let's say bad apples, a good way to put it. But overall, it's been my experience, and I've heard it from many drivers, including Wes, that racing people is as good a people as there is on earth.
Right.
And I agree with it with my heart, because I've seen it with my own eyes and lived it.
I think somebody that you've competed with, you kind of develop a special feeling through competition, and it kind of endures those relationships a little bit. But Lyle, I want to ask you, is there a story that either Wes told you about racing or that you saw Wes racing that you could tell us about?
Well, I'll say this. So Wes, and kind of generalize, and Wes loved racing. I think there's still several, I know there's still several drivers that he raced against that are alive today, and I think most of them will tell you he'd race hard and he'd race you clean. And if you banged off him, he's going to come back and get you. But he wasn't going to, if you stayed clean with him, he's going to stay clean with you if it's a 100-lapper or a 25-lapper. I think overall to say one thing about Wes would be he loved racing, and he loved the guys he raced with. He loved competition. I just think that some of his best thing up about racing, I don't know if it's his best thing, but he loved his fellow competition. He loved to compete, and it was just, you met a lot of good people over the years. I don't know if there's anything that stands out more than anything else, like you asked, but he had a big heart, and he would try to help anybody he could help, and he was helped by a lot of good guys over the years, and that's why he tried to help kids when they came along.
Yeah.
And he loved racing, and it was his life, really.
Well, once again, Lyle, let me congratulate you and your family on Wes being inducted into the C.A.R.B Hall of Fame.
Mike, I appreciate it. My family appreciate it, and I know Wes probably as good as anybody when he was alive, and I'll guarantee you he would be very proud of it and appreciate it.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Well, folks, that's going to wrap it up for Wes Farrand being inducted into the C.A.R.B Hall of Fame for the class of 2012.
There's a subtle change in the prairie wind, a big storm brewing on the plains again. Where the Kansas farmer wants to till the ground. Hey, listen everybody, can you feel the sound? Fields of thunder rumble with the roar of big machines. Fields of thunder, you can almost taste the smell of gasoline. When the cars fly by the finish line and the rush pulls you under, you'll see the light and you'll know why they're called Fields of Thunder.